All right. I started one
Recording
recorder.
in progress.
And there's the Zoom recorder. Zoom is my backup, actually. I actually have my other digital recorder that I use as my primary. This is behind the scenes information for those of you that are aspiring podcasters. Thanks for listening. I'm joined by Dalin Rose, back on the program to talk some Anne. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
You know, I'm okay. You know, it was a busy morning, but it's worked out almost completely on schedule.
Well, I know that life very well.
we were just talking about how our schedules finally coincided to do Anne episode 2. We talked about episode 1. It's, of course, of Anne with an E. For those who are just tuning in, you might want to dig back in the feed. And if I'm real smart, I'll maybe drop it as a rerun ep after this one or something if people want to, you know, just to make them backwards. I try to make it as confusing as possible to find episodes, but luckily I don't have to try that hard because I'm not very organized. Listeners will know. So, you know, if you want to listen to episode 1, if you don't, I think it'll be okay. You'll survive. That's my prediction, is that no one will.
Yeah, the world won't end.
Yeah, exactly. It won't make the world end. Not this time. Although, if you've seen Cabin in the No, I'm just kidding. So, which I haven't. I just read the book.
Yes, me too.
I didn't care for it. Anyway, but that's not where we're here. This is a very interesting, we're talking about episode 2 of Anne with an E. And I wanted to start out with something that the name of this episode is I Am No Bird and No Net Ensnares Me, which is, unless I'm remembering wrong, but I think that's the name. Watched, you know, upon rewatch, that's a Charlotte Bronte quote. And I actually, see if I can do it correctly, if I line up my pen. For those who might be watching the video, our Patreon subscribers get to see that. Over there. There we go. Well, I have that quote hanging on my wall. That's what I'm saying. And so I was like, oh, I forgot that was the name of this. And it's an interesting quote that I really do enjoy. But so anyway, that's my first thing to share. Upon reviewing this episode and thinking about it, what kind of thoughts did you have initially?
Well, the thing that I took away from the episode that I totally forgot about is how bleak it is from a cinematography perspective, and how I think that's so reflective of the mood of the characters, and especially in comparison to the first episode from a visual perspective.
Very sweeping, you know, Prince Edward Island, Avonlea, like all these flowers and such. Yeah, gotcha. That's an interesting point. I didn't think of those as going along together. Yeah, sometimes I miss that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that there's like a really big correlation within, especially the cinematography of this show, reflecting the energy of the characters, in particular when it comes to the Cuthberts and with Anne and how she's feeling in an episode. And this one does that to an almost large extreme, which we could get into in specific sequences.
Oh, yeah, we will. I also, and we'll get into exactly what they are, but there are 7 words, and they're actually grouped in 3 and 4. Those are 2 separate lines of dialogue. One of them is 3 lines, and one of them is 4 lines that, for me, are the core of this episode, because they're things that Anne has never heard, probably, in her life. And you can probably guess what they are, but...
I have a feeling I know what they are.
We'll pretty quickly probably land on the first one and talk about this. The other thing that strikes me is this: the whole series is very adept at the use of trauma in the narrative, and how, and I think a pretty realistic picture of trauma, maybe even more than other iterations of Anne of Green Gables, as far as delving into that, which. It's probably, you know, it's not fair to I guess I'm not putting any of the past ones down because I think that just wasn't as refined, you know, and it wasn't completely absent either, but I feel like this really hits that dynamic of that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I think it affects more characters than just Anne. Anne's PTSD is very obviously tied to something, you know, we have PTSD though affecting particularly Marilla. So we'll dig into. So narratively, we have the part of the story that if anyone's ever watched or read any of the Anne stuff, very big part of the story, which is the brooch. It was at the end of last episode, where the brooch, Marilla's, family heirloom brooch is missing. She blames Anne for it. Really pushy. Anne finally says, well, you just want me to tell you that I did? Is that what you're saying? Yes, I want you to admit it. Okay, I did it. Oh, I can't believe you would do that. You know what? I think you should go back to the orphanage. Wait, you told me to say that. I was lying, right? And so it's kind of like digging into a hole then trying to dig deeper to get out, right?
It is, and also like it's so interesting how their relationship is so much about Anne wanting to be like, looked upon by Marilla as, a family member and also someone that could be trusted, because throughout her whole life, there's not really been anyone who's viewed her in that sort of loyal way that she's always strived for. And to have Marilla basically force her to lie is just, truly one of the most like gut-wrenching things, but also is something that is so relatable, I think, because of parent and child dynamics in that way that are very familiar to me, at least.
And there is a definitely part of that. Hang on one second. This is a bonus for those of you who might be watching. I have a battery issue on my side. Hold on one second.
Okay.
I won't make noise for a second. And we're back after that word from our sponsor. The sponsor is batteries. They're powerful until they aren't. Anyway, on that we were at. And one of the things that has already happened is that Anne's experience has already been better than ever, right? Because she's been in homes where she was essentially the indentured servant of the home. That's why people adopted maybe, or at least the people she was with. I don't want to malign adoption.
And that's even something that gets brought up in this episode, because a lot of people later on, which we'll get into in depth, I think, later on.
Yes. And so being sent to this area that's like, she had this hope. She let her guard down enough to have hope that maybe this is a forever place. And then it's like, hey, you did a thing I didn't like. You got to get out. And of course, we know, if I didn't mention, at the end of episode 1, she was sent back to the orphanage, and almost immediately afterwards, Marilla finds that she had dropped the brooch behind some stuff and is mortified that she would have done this. I mean, to be fair, she is immediately heartbroken and feels so ashamed that, and then Matthew runs to the station. And in the beginning of this, we find that she's gone already, right? She left. And almost even more hurtful is when he asks the conductor, or not conductor, but the train station guy, I think is the term. Hey,
station agent?
Yeah, there you go. You got it. Hey, what
thanks, Peter Dinklage.
Yes, there you go. It was aptly played by Peter Dinklage in another IP.
In another film.
And he says, how was she? And he says, quiet. And it's almost like, oh no, that's like she's dead. I mean, for Anne, because she's not quiet, generally.
Yeah,
speaking.
That's a huge red flag.
Yeah.
That something's up.
And in the past, I mean, and I think you can see where this hurt her maybe more than some of the past rejections, because she was still chatty. She was telling stories and things still during those other rejections and those other disappointments. So very interesting to see that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because I think seeing the polar opposite emotions of both of these episodes, I think, is very much brought upon in those moments where Matthew is, trying so hard to prove that he loves Anne and that he's always going to be there for Anne. And then to hear that all the things he loved about Anne are being kind of retracted through these actions that occurred in their family drama, I think is so much more gut-wrenching for him.
Yes.
And we see that in those first few moments, and the acting in those scenes just gets me.
Oh, and you feel like, I mean, Matthew's like a big damn hero in this one. I mean, all this he goes through. And I think particularly Oh, and one of the things I really value that I think helps to sell and explain some of the issues of trauma, social anxiety, those things is the characters are doing things they maybe have never done before.
Hmm.
Marilla's certainly never gone through this kind of trauma. Matthew certainly has. I don't even know that he's left Avonlea very often, right?
Yeah, because they're very introverted.
Yeah. And so to go and to then sort of even acquaint himself with a pawn shop where he sells his watch,
Oh, man.
he gets run over, essentially shoved into a carriage and wakes up in a, some place where they're trying to take care of him. People are like, "Oh, you must be a drunk. You must be fighting. You got this head wound," which, the other thing that strikes you, it's not like people aren't mean now, but holy cow, back in those days, at least the way it's depicted, very blunt.
Yeah, they make a lot of assumptions about someone just based on like the state that they're in, yet they have no context for the fact that this poor man was waiting outside of an orphanage
Yeah.
like at night, sitting on a stoop. I would look that bad if that happened to me.
And how horrible, probably representative of reality, but how horrible was this orphanage? We not just Anne's flashbacks, but even just the matron being like, why are you talking to me?
Well, I think in the great, lineage or legacy of awful orphanage owners, she seemed pretty much on point. I'm looking at you, Miss Hannigan.
Like, so at least Miss Hannigan would sing, right?
Yeah, that's true. Or be, adorably drunk.
Or at least hit on whoever it was, the laundryman or the milkman, whatever.
Or she would hit on Matthew, maybe. You never know.
Oh man, this is an Elseworld what if scenario. If we put it
Of
into
the multiverse.
Yes, this is the multiverse. Now, what's your guess for my first three words? Because it comes up right here, what we're talking about.
Oh, she's my daughter.
Fair. Yes, exactly. It builds up, and it's for me the emotional core of the both of these little instances. The emotional core of the episode, where she rejects Matthew, which gets into some of the stuff with Anne I want to talk about. But she says, "Leave me alone. I don't want to go back. You're just going to send me away whenever you feel like it. I can't have that hanging over my head anymore." Essentially, and then somebody even gets involved. And is like, is he bothering you? Do you know him? What's going on? And this guy's about to kick Matthew's ass. And he just says, "It's okay. She's my daughter." And those three words hit. Obviously, three words that I think this character, Anne, has never heard before applied to her.
No, never.
And she almost immediately crumbles and embraces him, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said about the longing of Anne wanting to have some sort of familial connection that's really, really talked about in this episode, probably more than any other. Especially because even before that, she goes into her whole tall tale with the milkman about, what her family's like and their grand adventures and them being into espionage with the queen and all this stuff, which I love.
Yeah. Did you think he knew that it wasn't true?
I think that there is a degree to which, and, I could get into a whole diatribe about the way that, fat characters are depicted within this show, because that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But there is a simple nature to this milkman that to some degree, I think, has a earnest quality of him just wanting to believe in the energy of Anne. But there is also sometimes a little bit like, oh, he's a fat, simple milkman. So
we have to see him eating, for example. Although I guess, he feeds her and that's pertinent. But yeah,
right.
That's always my... It's kind of like this is one of my issues on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is a show that I love, but it was interesting to see, especially the big old lazy detectives. They started out as characters that were kind of quirky, funny, awful in some ways, and then it just became a big joke about they're always eating because they're fat,
right?
which is the only the only comedic attribute.
Yeah, well, and. As some of your listeners will come to realize about me, I am very much a fat activist and also someone who talks a lot about like fat phobia in media. So that's kind of the stuff that I pick up on. And while I do think that this portrayal of this character, even though it's just a small little bit part, isn't like very significant within the entirety of the show, I do think that there is a degree to which you could read into his simple, accepting nature, playing into the fact that he also has an entire, little picnic of food and talks about food and he's
Right.
a milkman, all that sort of
Yes.
stuff.
He's got to be eating all the time. Come on.
Right.
Right. Exactly. That's a good point. I think really good point. And you look at her retreating more into that. It's an interesting thing that she uses storytelling, she uses poetry, she uses imagination to survive. One of the things we see that I did not see as much in the other iterations of Anne of Green Gables, especially the classic one. Two elements, really. One is Anne's street smarts, and the other is we get to see more of Anne's anger, especially at Marilla. And I would say even appropriate anger to say, you shouldn't have treated me like that,
Yeah. Well, and there's a degree to which, I think we don't get to see that side of Anne in other adaptations because from a, cultural standpoint, there wasn't enough examples of young girls sticking up for themselves against parental figures. And having that be in this modern iteration of this story, and in a time where that's becoming more prevalent for children and young girls in general to, establish who they are, is something that's really important, especially, and I know we just talked about it, but in the scene when the guy notices that her and Matthew are having that confrontation in the train station, is so much a scene that is a product of the time that show is made and not something that would have existed beforehand, because otherwise most male characters would be like, oh, whatever, this little girl's getting bothered by this man.
It's, it is interesting when we apply those things backwards. And I think you could make a case either way. Like you said, is that just because of modern times we'd like to see someone behave well? On the other hand, is there no one who would have said chivalry, type of thing to say, what I mean? We do make that assumption. And she does have to evade the weird abductor, kidnapper, whatever was going to happen.
Oh my God, that scene is so scary.
Well, and not only because, she, once again, her street smarts, she's like, this is wrong. Obviously, I don't know you. And I know what goes on.
Stranger danger.
Right, exactly. Yeah. She knows, and I think we can see there's evidence in some of the flashbacks. None of them, there's never anything graphic, but there is evidence of Anne having trauma of abuse. And we don't know exactly what forms of abuse, but she is also, has more knowledge about, that comes up in a kind of comedic, kind of sad way in another episode we'll get into, but she... has more knowledge about things of the world because she had to survive. And so she knows nothing good will happen if I go with this man. I'm going to scream and yell and run. And then, but the scariest part to me is he turns around to these two boys immediately and is like, hey, you guys going to come with me? And, that's so we know he's a creeper, but oh my gosh.
Exactly. And also the fact that he's like, oh, I have these sweets that are in my car and you should come and be there. Like, it's going to be great. And all this stuff, And I think, again, there's a little bit of hint to a bit of commentary in this episode about the way parents or parental adult figures abuse children in that way or misuse them. And I think that's kind of the overarching thing in this episode.
And one thing that I think is really good about Anne really standing up for herself in this thing, this situation, is that it illuminates something that exists. I still see exists in adopted and foster relationships with those things. Even with well-intentioned parents, there is often an expectation that there should be this gratitude. And so I think that may have gone into the writing of some of the older properties of Anne. And in fact, I don't recall. I read the book a million years ago, and I don't recall it going deeply into that or whether it did, but it just wasn't necessarily thought about. It probably had that same mentality that, well, of course she'd just be happy to go back. Oh, wow. Thank goodness I get to go back. And it's like, do I even want to? Are you going to give me, are you going to give me a box of buried treasure and then take it away? Then I don't even want it. I don't even want it if it's going to be used to manipulate me or used as cause fear. Right.
Right. Well, and the fact that she connects in that confrontation the thought that, Matthew and Marilla pushing her away as bullying. And that also in the episode, she thinks about the times that the young girls at the orphanage bullied her with the mice, the rats eating her. I think is such an interesting correlation that I feel like other versions, though they have like maybe that sort of animosity between the characters, they don't make that connection as like psychologically she would think of that as bullying.
Right. Yes, because when you bring someone into your home, it is a great service out there. Any who's doing adoption, doing foster, you're doing a great thing, but it depends. And the people I see who do best with this are people who truly view those in their care as their children. It's like, and foster, of course, can be traumatic that way too, because they can be taken back or reassigned by the state or whatever. But that's its own animal. But the adoption care, we don't go around in our homes. Maybe we should more, but we take for granted where we live. We still have ups and downs. We're still whole people, and an adopted person is a whole person in their own right, just like everybody else. And they're gonna have tantrums, and they're gonna have issues, and if you don't expect that, and if you don't allow for it, then you're being unrealistic. It's not gonna, it's not gonna work. And if you just expect them to always be like, "Oh, thank you for saving me from what I could have had," and that's just something to be aware of in the adoption dynamic. People just need to be aware of it and watch for it. It's normal, but it's just something that people need to get over that hurdle, I think, and most do. I think.
Yeah.
But
I think that's the kind of hurdle that like they're definitely trying to get through in this episode, and especially when it comes to Marilla and Anne's relationship.
Yes, I want to get into Marilla. One quick thing I wanted to say about Anne, and it's been long enough. I apologize if I said this last episode. There is such a thing as what they call reactive attachment disorder. And the disorder basically is those that have been traumatized or greatly neglected sometimes grow up with a damaged ability to attach to people, which is one of our most fundamental psychological abilities that can help with relationships and happiness. And there's the two types. There's inhibited attachment, which means you just don't really attach, at least not very much. And this is a scale, so it's not all or nothing. But the other side of that scale is disinhibited, which means that you get really good at attachment, but the hard part is maintenance and deepening that beyond just a shallow point. And Anne could be a good example of that second type. I always also use Little Orphan Annie, if you watch that movie. And I think of the musical number where all the servants are like, "Annie, hey, we love you." And it's like, "I love everyone." But then it's like, "Oh, I might get better. I can trade up to," obviously when she thinks her parents are alive, she wants. But even before she knows that, she's like, "Will you spend a bunch of money and time to help me find them?" Because I'm not necessarily deepening the attachment, whatever. And I see that here where she's very good at attaching, but because of fear and anxiety and different things with that, it's hard for her to maintain that or to believe in its maintenance. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And also, I just want to pinpoint how brilliant the connection you made between Annie and Anne is, because not only do they have similar names, but they're redheads.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and they have a hard time, connecting, like you said, with their adoptive families.
And to be fair, on the other side, both Daddy Warbucks and Marilla and Matthew, they all have trauma. They all have difficulty in their own attachments, right?
They do.
Yeah.
They
and
do.
Especially communication.
Right. And I think honestly the archetype of that really in a way is Daddy Warbucks, because he is the toxic man that has a very hard time shaking his cold, hard, muddy exterior.
Weapons dealer, as we kind of gloss over in the movie.
Yeah, and Marilla also in a lot of ways is kind of the yin and yang of that. Like she instead of being a cold, muddy, man, she's a tight, to the chest woman who's had to do a lot of things for herself because other people haven't done them for her.
And one more comment about Little Orphan Annie, and then I'll move on. But I did a presentation about attachment disorder once where I used her as an example of disinhibited attachment. However, I thought it was really fascinating. I found a quote from the creator of the original Little Orphan Annie comic strip, which was how it started. with no eyeballs for some reason. And Little Orphan Annie and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They're both of their original source
Just little
material
dots.
has no, yeah, or just white, sometimes just white pupils. So whatever that's about, I don't know. It's hard to draw eyes, but hands and eyes, hard to draw. Famously hard to draw, though. So, but there's a quote from the creator where he said that this is not a lighthearted romp. This is someone who has been a survivor. This is someone who, has to, is good at problem solving and adventures. It's not a lighthearted character. It's not meant to be that way. And I thought that was very interesting when you apply that to Anne as well and say, boy, I see real depth, in how she is handling things. So Marilla, as we will move to her and her trauma, she is also the great emotional core line giver, the 4 words that I'm thinking of. I felt like that was kind of mean when I put you on the spot, although you got it. You knew what they were, the 3. Do you want to take a crack at the 4 that I liked, the 4 words?
Oh.
This is kind of a hard one, I think.
Oh. Honestly, when it comes to Marilla, there's a lot of iconic dialogue she says in this episode. So I don't know, but definitely tell me.
Yeah, it has to it's near the end of this, and what Marilla does when she gets back is she does hardly anything. She's been just crying. She's been baking. She's been taking extra care of the French boy who works for them. Rachel Lynn has to almost physically, yeah, he's a great kid. I love that character. Rachel Lynn has to almost physically restrain her from becoming the 3rd person to go out on the dangerous trip. And and we do see a flip here, by the way. Rachel Lynn, all of a sudden, she's all in. She's like, you're going to get her back. She's your kid. You're a family. I'm sending my husband to look too. And you need to wait for them. So Marilla, though, inadvertently, when Anne gets back, she shuts down emotionally. She goes into practical, I'm making dinner. Doesn't even say welcome back, really. And inadvertently sends the message that I don't care. You know what I mean? That's what Anne interprets it as. And in the end of the episode, the 4 words, long trip to get here, are, will you forgive me?
That's a good point. I didn't think of those. I mean, I guess it's more that I focused on the action of the conversation even happening than the specific words, And I think that that's important.
Yeah, and it takes Anne having a breakdown as she's being, gossiped about and talked about very obviously at the church picnic. And one of the things, too, I do like, because when you're watching it with a modern eye, and, they got to have the characters reconcile and, everything. So they have to work that in. But I like how there's a consistency, not only to the characters as they're written, because it takes a minute, and Matthew doesn't say, hey, why don't you 2 work it out? Because he would never say that.
No, never. He is a walk quietly with a big stick kind of guy.
Exactly. And avoid that kind of communication at all cost. So you don't see Marilla self-correct at first, right? Until she realizes what Anne's going through, and then she lays it out for her in such a way that she's like, you lied to me because I made you lie to me. That's terrible that I did that. She admits her wrong and she says, will you forgive me? And it takes that experience to get there. And I think it's also not just true to the character, but true to the essence of trauma damage and a lifetime of non-communication.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that the most interesting parts of this episode are the moments where Anne is talking to female characters, whether it be, when she's having that poetry moment with the girls at the train station and they're the only ones that are willing to listen to her. And also, the moments that she has with, I'm forgetting her name right now, her best friend.
Diana,
thank you.
Kindred spirits. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yes. That, those and then Marilla, I think, are the most, complex and the most in-depth conversations that she has throughout this episode. And I think the pinnacle of that is uncovering the relationship that she has deep down with Marilla, and that they both share a unique, very specific perspective of trauma, and going through this kind of life where they've had to take care of themselves and not have anybody else take care of them, right? And that unfolds in this moment of them finally opening up to each other in a way where Marilla admits her faults and embraces that. And I think that's just so powerful.
And then the head on the shoulder moment too, where
Oh my God.
she leans over and puts her head on her shoulder, and a lot of that actions, and once again those words. I don't know that anyone's ever asked Anne for forgiveness for the wrongs they've done her, because no, it's just like, you get this because stuff runs downhill and you're at the bottom.
Right.
Nobody's considering her a person enough to do that.
Yeah, and I think, going back to the scene that, precedes that, where, they enter the party and there's all these people making all of these awful judgments about Anne, and they're saying like, oh, why would they even adopt her? Is she a servant? Is she, just a thing that they got? Like, why would anyone even do that in this society? People look at her as an object.
And why bring her back if you sent her away?
Right.
You must have been unhappy with her. And so that's very interesting. As you were saying that, it just hit me that is an assumption that Anne is in the wrong here. Well, what did she do to get sent away? Well, why did they bring her back? Well, right. I guess, they're going crazy. And there's nobody, and obviously, who knows? I mean, Rachel Lynn doesn't tend to keep her mouth shut. Who knows what? But it certainly either wasn't discussed or wasn't considered as serious that was a shitty thing to do, to just dump her because you thought she did something. Right.
Well, and I think societally, people don't want to assume that, an elderly or mature, family like the Cuthberts that are, there's many comments made that they're like the oldest family in the area and that they're senior citizens compared to everybody else.
And kind of an unusual family too,
right.
Brother and sister. Yeah.
Right. And why would they ever do anything wrong? It must be the rascal of a child that they brought into this situation. It has to be her fault,
One of the interesting things that we find out later in the series, not to spill the tea too much, is that Marilla and Matthew, their mother had a family tragedy. And their mother completely went into what they might call a melancholy at the time, or what we would call now depression or trauma, PTSD, something like that, to where she shut down. She didn't function. She didn't take care of them. Marilla had to step it up. And I think that's where you see when people are under pressure, we go towards our comfort behaviors. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, the things we do to comfort ourselves can be even more divisive than disagreements. Active disagreements, I don't think, hurt relationships as much as different sources of comfort do, especially when we don't talk about it, right? And when one of those coping skills is not talking about it, but you see Marilla really holding close to, she's cooking, she's got to go feed the kid, she's got to go do something, and when she doesn't do anything, she sits down and breaks down. So her, Anne's back, her service, she's overwhelmed, she goes into that. As they say, when you have trauma, it's usually fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Mm-hmm. Those are the four unhealthy trauma responses, right? Fawning meaning pleasing or taking care of people, and there's some element of that to where she's surviving by practically taking care of business, right?
Right, and having a routine, because that's a whole other thing too, is that Marilla is someone that lives by like a system and a routine, and when something breaks that up, like Anne and her very quirky ways, I think that that's something that kind of shakes the thing that she has to keep herself going, and why there's an animosity between them.
And I think the really interesting thing as I was watching this and noticing the dynamic, I don't think that, I know I'm reading into the character's reaction, but I don't think Marilla thought it was cool what she was doing. I think she could tell that she was hurting, and she could tell that Anne was hurting. The attitude wasn't mean; it was bewilderment, or being lost. I don't know what to do. I'm doing this. It's not working. I'm making it worse. I can kind of tell, but I don't know what to do. And it wasn't until once again, I think the fear and the desperation of Anne is running off. She, and literally Anne's the first one to bring it up and ask, why you don't want me, do you?
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I think you can read into that. Sometimes when people ask a question like that, there's some degree to where you wouldn't ask that question if you weren't hoping to hear a comforting answer.
Right. You wanted to hear a certain response.
It's like saying the question is really is more of a request. Please want me.
Mm-hmm. And I think, there is so much about Anne that while she can read poetry and read into analyzing deep, thoughts for someone her age, she needs literal sentences said to her that are proof of someone's feelings. And having just someone be like, okay, here's your room, here's your house, I'm making you food, but I'm doing it in sort of an angsty, angry fashion, does not connect to her as someone loving her. And she needs someone to literally say things like, you are my daughter, I am here for you. Those words of affirmation are really important to her.
Yeah. And you see where she also lacks the training and life experiences of having and never having a family that was accepting and never having family at all.
Right.
And the only experiences are you're this object, you're this servant, you're this, and having no real background. So we see, that's where we see she doesn't always know when to fight and when to restrain herself. And, there's an interesting type of healthy, it sounds funny to say from a therapist maybe, but there's healthy repression just like there is unhealthy repression. We all have to regulate our emotions every day. If I share every emotion that I have with every person or any person at random, that can be damaging to my life, career-wise, relationship-wise. There are times where we have to wait. We have to pick our battles. We have to figure out how to approach someone. And you see times where, like in episode 1, Rachel Lynn's like, well, she's kind of ugly. And Anne's like, so are you. Screw you. I shouldn't say screw you, but more in the time, language of the time, like you're awful. Yeah. And that, not knowing when to pick the battle kind of thing and not being like, let me ask Marilla for comfort because no one's going to comfort her. That's the expectation, right? At first.
Right.
So now you see that being challenged, that belief.
Right, exactly. And also, there is a really big connection I've noticed between the way that Anne will express anger and also the way that Marilla expresses anger, and how while they look different because of their ages, they actually share a very similar core of wanting people to not lie to them and wanting people to be truthful to them and to do things like that. And I think that moment you pointed out with Rachel is a very, big example of that.
And, circling back to Rachel just for a second, it is interesting that one of the things I like about the dynamic is, and anybody who's been in any kind of tight-knit community of any kind, I think can identify with this, that, oh, here's this person I kind of have to deal with because they're my friend, but they kind of suck sometimes.
Right.
But there's
or they're the center
else.
Of the community. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
and yet you see to where she's also a good friend in this episode, a great friend, really, coming in and saying like, all right, we're doing this, we're helping, I'm here for you. And then when they even get back saying like, great, you're a family again. Isn't that wonderful? You can tell. And who knows, maybe it's because she's prickly. There might even be some attachment there that she's starting to form to Anne and saying like, oh, wow, she's feisty, and she's kind of fun. And I don't know that. And of course I know that the character doesn't exist outside the show, so she doesn't have any secret motivations, but in the context of the story, it is interesting to see that here's a person who is complicated, just like a real life person.
Yeah, well, and I think she definitely, within the context of the show, as the series progresses for sure, definitely has a lot of different motivations and feelings towards Anne, and that her relationship with Anne is only beginning to get more and more and more detailed and layered and complicated, especially when it comes to the behavior of who Anne presents herself publicly, and how because Rachel is like I said, like a core center of the community within that world, what Anne does is very, bounces back off of like the social interactions that Rachel has with other people.
And in a way, it mirrors the relationship some of the elements of the relationship that Rachel has with Matthew and Marilla, especially Marilla, where you catch Marilla like rolling her eyes a lot when she's talking to Rachel. Of like, she's that kind of friend. It's like, yeah, okay, she said this, so you're just part of Rachel. And so it's a similar dynamic for everyone in the family, the new family that's forming.
Yeah, well, and I said this in the last episode, but I relate to that aspect of Marilla and her having these kind of relationships with this like social circle of this world, and how a lot of the time she just hears these like, rich, inflated 1% people saying these outrageous things, and she just has to be like, oh God, like I have to hang out with them because there's no one else to hang out with.
Right. And there is a dependency on that interaction. Although I feel like Matthew could happily just be like, she could go away forever. He just can't even with Rachel Lynn.
Yeah. Well, that's because, again, like he out of all of the characters is the most introverted. And so he like truly does not need any of their, commentary in his life at all. Yes. And I actually wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit more because, I'm a visual person. And one of the things I noticed, like I brought up with the cinematography of the show, is the costume design in this episode. And how
talk about that.
Yeah. So especially in the picnic church party scene that they have that, is the precursor to the big Marilla and emotional conversation, when the Cuthberts and Anne, now being a part of the family, goes with them, they are dressed throughout the series, but especially this scene, in neutral tones that are very different than the rest of the pastel, soft color palette that the rest of the town wears. And I think that that's a really interesting visual cue to differentiate between the dynamics of these families and how outside of the perimeters of society the Cuthberts are.
That's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, especially when you see, like you say, Diana's family, who are like, ooh,
yeah,
that's my impression of her father, especially.
I love that.
It's essentially all you can hear them say. It's like if the teacher from Snoopy was a big rich snob.
Yeah, he's Stuffy McStufferson.
Yes.
And then the mother is also like that, like, oh, can't be associated with those people, Diana. No. But my child can pick up a biscuit, eat half of it, and then put it down on a plate. That's fine.
Right. Same behaviors, but it doesn't come from the context of someone I'm judging. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Because I get it. I get my own context, but others, and very interesting, when you see that played out today, I do see that dynamic where there are some families where the value of who you associate with is kind of like, it basically is sort of like, who is the best person to hang out with that will, have something to do with your social status or productivity, or, you see that. And it's an amplification. We all need to get our needs met in relationships, but to choose to stop hanging out with someone. And I see this even in elementary school sometimes with kids who are like, that's been their training, is to say, oh, this person isn't very fill in the blank. So therefore, they're not part of the social in crowd in some form. So let me ostracize and cut them out of my life so that I can spend more time with Stuffy Richardson down the road.
McStufferson.
McStufferson, there we go. Instead of hanging out with someone like Doc McStuffins, who's a good quality person, but a little eccentric, right? Because she has living stuffed animals, which is also awesome.
Yeah. I love Doc stuff. It's so cute. I love it. But the thing I was going to say is like kind of related to that. I think culturally, we are trained from a very young age to pick people based on aesthetics.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think that that's kind of reflected in the costume design thing that I mentioned too, that everyone in the town wants to associate with people that look like them from both a societal, rich, wealthy standpoint, and also just based on aesthetic presentation of having nice hair and wearing bright colors and, not looking like, having messy braids like Anne's hair and, wearing like, very, uh, what's the word I want to use? Plainly kind of clothes compared to the other people in the town.
Which is really interesting that you see even Anne, who, as we mentioned, her social programming has been lacking,
Mhm.
or as far as her social learning or social skills. But she's picked up on that too because she wishes she were, and I'm doing air quotes for the audio version here, prettier, right?
Mhm.
She wants to have nicer, and even when Marilla makes her dresses, and it's like, wow, but they're kind of plain, and I don't know if I want to look like that. So
Right.
it's interesting that it plays into that aesthetic. And I guess you could say, I mean, Marilla's reacting to it too because she's choosing plainer dresses because we don't need that. And we're just normal kind of people who are unassuming, and that's vanity. And so I guess we all bump into that aesthetic obsession or aesthetic interest. I don't know what to call it, but
Yeah, well,
yeah.
or just like aesthetic connection that we feel like we have to kind of be within this pact that matches our own presentation. And I think what is doubly more interesting is that Anne does not perceive that at all when it comes to her social connections. She just sees people as for who they are, and she doesn't base who she's going to become friends with based on what they are presenting themselves to the world as.
That's a great point. Yeah, she doesn't expect that of others, but she expects that they expect it of her, which, once again,
Right.
very human dynamic that we get into, particularly when there's been trauma and neglect and abuse, is that I
Right.
anticipate the world will say the worst. Well, as we're, as we're drawing up on time for today's episode, I can't help but say we have to talk about the capstone ending here, the family Bible, and Anne's invitation to be included in the family Bible. You are now, and I don't recall, I haven't seen every version, right, of this story, but I don't recall her ever going by Anne Shirley Cuthbert in the other versions. I thought that was a brilliant maneuver in this one to say, yeah, you're a Cuthbert now. You're an Anne Shirley Cuthbert. And I just thought that was a very interesting type of scene to have. As you're talking about the wardrobe, it is interesting. One thing I did notice is that when they bring her down from the upstairs and say, we want you to officially be part of our family, we're cementing that obviously doing that they won't send her away again and that she is now a forever member of their family. They're all dressed up like they're going
They
to church or
are.
something. Yeah.
Which is so sweet. And I think, when you think about the fact that this scene is taking place at a time where I don't think there is that kind of, or there wasn't the groundwork for that to be a sort of celebratory thing that your family, did a big special thing for. Getting to see them dressed up, and then even more so, and being like, well, we should make a bigger moment of this. Like, we should do all these
We did
crazy
a
things. And of course, like,
ceremony.
yeah, all of her suggestions are like a lot, you know?
We're gonna sort of say an incantation over a moving river, or
Right.
literally
We should,
cut our
yeah.
fingers and bleed together. Can you
We should
imagine?
join our blood. Billy Bob. Oh my God, I can't say his name.
Billy Bob Thornton.
Angela. Yeah. Thank you. I was all the words, like the way with
Yeah,
the blood vials.
right. Angelina Jolie and Billy Bob Thornton sharing each other's
Yeah,
blood. Yeah, exactly.
I was like, wow, girl, that's a big
Well,
commitment.
and it does show her separation from society, as we see an ongoing thing. You pointed out is her acceptance of other people, and that even gets not tested because she's immediately accepting, but eventually we see as some queer LGBT issues come into the show, which is definitely not in the old ones, but
Yeah,
is that she has no trouble accepting people who are marginalized by society,
right.
and so she's like, hey, we can pray around a tree. We can, talk about, just the divine feminine aspects, things that are outside the norm, especially for the time, right? being able to say she's an outsider to some extent, and that both makes her life difficult, but also is one of her own superpowers. Sort of is that she sees outside the norm. Yeah,
yeah, and I love that she extends that even into the creation of her name. That she tries to add all these little things, like I've always wanted to have this cool thing in my name, and adding like what was
Cordelia.
it? Yeah, or adding the I always forget what that's called. The line, a hyphen.
Oh
No.
yeah, hyphenating Shirley and Cuthbert, and she keeps doing a do-over in the family Bible, which is it is very perfect, and you see their reaction like, oh okay, no, okay, all right.
Oh, so much. The other thing that
is very family-ish, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's so family oriented, and it makes their relationship seem so organic in that way. The other thing that I literally just thought of, because we were talking about the whole blood vials thing, is I just realized they're drinking what I think it's cranberry juice or raspberry juice.
Raspberry cordial. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that's supposed to emulate, maybe from a cinematic perspective, blood, because of like
whoa.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I just thought about that.
Got a Bible right there. I know that raspberry cordial plays a big role in what's upcoming in the stories. That's another classic part you see. But it's very interesting to have. And as far as the family Bible scene, I've never seen that anywhere before. And so they chose to bring that in as the introduction to Anne of the raspberry cordial. Anyway, wow. And the mix up with wine and stuff. So, yeah, that's very interesting. That's very intriguing, especially when you throw in the religious sort of, at least, attachment to the Bible and what blood represents from a Christian perspective. Very interesting.
Well, and also because she makes the suggestion that that's a thing that they should do, like, as a way to celebrate, like we were saying, is like to combine their blood. And instead of actually doing that, they're drinking something that's symbolic of blood.
Oh, I like this. This is really good. Yeah. This is really good.
My film school training's coming too.
Well, so anything, let's see, anything else we should hit on about this? I want to give you a chance to tell everybody, more about, once again, about you and where they can find your work.
Thank you. I mean, I would say that my overall takeaway with this episode is I think it is a fundamental touchstone as to the kind of relationship that Anne and the Cuthberts are going to have throughout the course of the series, because I've seen the whole thing and I know, the direction it's going into. And also that I think there's beautiful acting in this episode. There's really great character building. And if you have a hard time understanding why people love Anne of Green Gables as a franchise, as a piece of pop culture, I think this episode is a great way of establishing that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It actually accomplishes one of the things that I love in stories, which so many times you see, whether it's a series, they take the whole first season to arrive somewhere, or a movie, the whole third act, the end of the third act when the credits roll. There's so many movies out there and so many shows out there that I'm like, okay, I wish we would have done that in the first act. It would be so interesting to see what comes next, right?
Right.
And I feel like they pull that out. There's a lot just in each episode, right? They pull that out right away. They don't spend the whole first season saying, let's cultivate this relationship. It's like, well, yeah, we cultivate it, but it's like, let's get rid of the threat, the specter of separation, right? Let's just get rid of that. And especially with romantic relationships, you'll see where season after season, a lot of sitcoms can't think of anything to do once the character's married. So when I was growing up, I don't know how old you are. When I was growing up, nobody ever got married. It was like they always had a failed marriage, a failed marriage ceremony. It was like they can't even pull the trigger on this couple getting married, because what do we do if there's not the will they, won't they, break up, not break up? I'm thinking, I'm looking at you, new girl, and other things like that, and other movies where they treat it like the hardest thing in the world to do is get together. Whereas actually maintaining and, anyway, I think in modern trends, you see where they're more willing to say, let's assume, okay, we got the relationship. There's a foundation of love and we're not getting rid of you and all this and all that. Now what? Which makes it way more interesting. Yeah.
It definitely does. And I honestly, I just want to say that I think we could, dovetail into a whole other podcast series about just the way relationships are like, viewed upon in movies and film, especially from a generational standpoint, because I think similarly, I am a 90s baby. So I've grown up with many, many different kinds of failed, messy, complicated relationships from the time I was born until, now.
Ooh,
And
this would
definitely
be
New Girls are good.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I like it. We'll have to do that. So teaser for everybody there.
There you go.
Well, tell everybody a little bit about what you do, where they can find you, where they can follow your reviews or other writings and things. Or just
Sure.
anything that you're doing.
Yeah. So, like at the beginning of the top of the show, my name's Dalin, and my online last name is Rose, but most of the time you can find my writing as Dalin Rowell on /film is predominantly where I'm writing these days. But I also am on Twitter. It's called It's Really Dalin, but it's 2 E's. So like a film reel. And
Dalin, spell Dalin for people just in case.
Sure. It's Dalin. And it's the spelling of my mom's name and my dad's name put together. So that's,
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. So right now I am focusing on writing, but also I'm trying really hard to come out with my own podcast because I'm a really big fan of Beauty and the Beast, the fairy tale, and I love to talk about it from an analytical standpoint of all the adaptations that have come out. So that's what I'm trying to do.
That's great. I'm gonna bookmark that, even though it's not on there yet.
It's coming.
I'm gonna pre-bookmark it in my head. But that sounds fascinating. That's exciting. So
thank you.
Well, great. Well, and as always, you can find stuff about this show at Break a Brain on Twitter. We are at Brainiacs Ahoy on Instagram because that was the only one I could think of that was available. There's that great coincide. Or Facebook.com/Broken Brain. So we're posting some more things there. You can also get involved with the show if you go to patreon.com. You can see the video of this and all, essentially all, if there is usable video for a show, then it will be available to patrons as well as bonus materials and also access to some mental health based courses and trainings are going up there as well. Lots of exciting things we're doing. That's patreon.com/Broken Brain. And even, if you're not in a position to do that, then that's fine. We're really glad to still have everybody out there listening. And I hope that you can find examples of these kinds of stories. And I hope this analysis is helpful for people to look around for the fact that these stories are being told and that they're using psychological elements and trauma and all that. It's fun to talk about, but also I think there's a message in there for any of us who struggle with any of those elements of life that people do. They're not telling these stories just because it's like, oh, this doesn't exist, let's make it up, right? It's if you have that experience and you feel on the outside, like Anne or whoever, you're not. You're inside a big, big group of those of us who have those struggles. So we'll just throw that out there. All right.
That's the truth.
Well, thank you, Dalin.
Thank you. This is so much fun.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtamparts.com.